And it's my delight to welcome Mr. Frank Hanna to speak at the Catholic University of America this afternoon as part of our distinguished lecture series, CEOs Speak on Business, Ethics, and Religion. Mr. Hanna is an entrepreneur and a merchant banker. He's a founder of CompuCredit, currently CEO of the investment firm Hanna Capital LLC, and was featured as one of 3 entrepreneurs in the PBS series, The Call of the Entrepreneur. He holds both a BBA and JD from University of Georgia and has been heavily involved in education for 30 years, establishing 3 new Catholic schools. One of them, the Holy Spirit Preparatory School, has been recognized as one of the top 50 Catholic high schools in the country. Mr. Hanna is a Knight of Malta, which as a native of Malta is dear to my heart. So he's also a Knight of the Holy Sepulchre, board member of the Papal Foundation, the St. John Vianney Seminary, the Acton Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Napa Institute, EWTN, and the Institute for Psychological Sciences, and was named by Pope Benedict as a Knight of the Grand Cross in the Order of St. Gregory. He's also served as co-chair of President George W. Bush's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans. He's the founder of the Solidarity Association, which has worked for many different charitable endeavors, most famously perhaps for its trusteeship of the Mater Verbi Papyrus, which is the oldest extant translation of the Lord's Prayer and also of significant chunks of the Gospels of both Luke and John. Mr. Hanna has received the William B. Simon Prize for Philanthropic Leadership and also the David R. Jones Award for Philanthropic Leadership. Most significantly for our purposes this afternoon, he's the author of the best-selling book, What Your Money Means and How to Use It Well. I read the book shortly after it came out and found it to be the single best treatment on how to think of and how to manage wealth as a Catholic. I found it also very helpful personally. As students, you may not have a lot of money right now, but as business students, our hope and yours, we know, is that someday you shall. Many of you, and so pay attention to his wisdom. Please join me in giving a warm CUA welcome to Mr. Frank Hanna.
Thank you, Andrew. And it's my pleasure to be here at Catholic University. And it's my hope that all of you make a lot of money when you get out there in the world. I don't claim to have all the answers to money and wealth, but I will tell you I've studied it a lot. I've consulted a lot of the wisdom of the world and of the church. But let me first tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book. My daughter, who just got married, and by the way, I'm just the guy to talk to about how to spend money after going through and paying for a daughter's wedding and going through all of that. But a few years ago when she was 15, I decided that it would be a good way for she and I to spend time together for her to be my apprentice at the office. And so for 3 days a week, she would come and sit with me and watch what I did and go to meetings with me and listen on the other side of phone calls and go to lunches and that sort of thing. And so she'd been doing this for about 2 days and watching what I do. I'm reading the newspaper and talking on the telephone, doing these different things. And she turned to me and said, "Daddy, when do we make the money?" And you know, it's kind of a profound, when do we make the money? And I started thinking, well, gosh, I don't know. I mean, I know I'm working hard. I know I'm busy. But when do we make the money? And that leads to more fundamental questions about money. How do we make money? It's kind of interesting, the phrase we have, that we would make money. And it got me thinking a lot about money and what it is we must do. I tend to think in business terms. I was raised in a family of business people. And it got me thinking, how do we create value and make a lot of money off of the value that we create? See, I was chasing this car. When I was a young man, I was chasing this car called Financial Success. And in 1995, I caught it. Now, you know when the dog's chasing the car? If the car actually stops, the dog sort of wonders, I was chasing it. Now what? I mean, I can't eat it. What do I do now with this car I was chasing? So I was chasing this car of Financial Success. And my brother and I, he's 2 years younger, and we sold this business. And boom, we got a chunk of money. earlier than I thought we would. So it forced me to say, okay, now what? Now that I've caught the car, what do we do with it? I'm fortunate. We were able to make a chunk of money. But I'm also a truth seeker. And I started asking myself, what am I supposed to do with it? And I'll tell you something, the more I searched, the more I realized that we're not taught the meaning of money. Some of us spend time learning how to make it. A lot of us spend time spending it. But hardly any of us spend time learning what it means to have it and thinking deeply about what we ought to do with it. I talked to a lot of wise folks, a lot of priests, a few bishops. And what was interesting was, as many wise people as I taught about, they'd not thought that systematically about this issue. The priests were hesitant to talk about it. They're actually hesitant to talk to us about money. They themselves don't have a lot of need to think about it. And they personally don't have the need, and they feel a little awkward telling us what to do with our money. I think of this absence of knowledge of money sort of like our unwillingness to talk about sexuality. You know, Pope John Paul II came along and said, wait a minute. Sexuality is a good thing. It's a blessing from God. And if we don't talk about it, we might fall into the wrong way to view it. So he created he didn't create it, but he sort of named this thing and brought into being this theology of the body. And so we don't have this notion that sexuality is just something dirty that you don't talk about. We realize, no, sexuality is a blessing, but we have to look at it with the right perspective to understand it and to use it well. And I think and I say we now because you folks are studying business and thinking about business and going to be in the business world, we need to develop a theology of wealth, a theology of money. It's part of our corporal existence. Corporal being that of the body. It's a blessing from God, and so we shouldn't be embarrassed about it, and we can't ignore it. The reason I ended up writing the book that Andrew, thank you for mentioning that, and thank you for your kind words. I wrote the book, I believe that each of us is here for a special reason. Now, you might hear in business sometimes there's a saying that I used to actually adhere to, and I no longer do. And that saying is that the graveyard is full of indispensable people. Now, what does that mean? What that means is nobody's really indispensable. You're going to die one day. You'll be in the graveyard. Somebody else will come in your place. The graveyard's full of indispensable people. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think each of us is indispensable. There are things we're specifically here to do, and that if we don't do it, no one else will do it. I'm not an author. The only reason I wrote the book is I was looking for knowledge about this, and nobody else had written the book, so I said, I got to write the book. And there will be other things that you find that come along in your life that you end up saying, but for me, this is something that first needs to be done, and secondly, but for me, it won't happen. And when you're trying to discern what to do with your life at different stages of it, that principle of indispensability I found is a really good tool of discernment to say, is this something that needs to happen first? And is it something that but for me won't happen and needs to happen? And if it is, then you might be the indispensable person to fill that need. So anyway, that's what led me to the book. I'm pretty convinced of this. For those of us who have material resources, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it's my hope that all of you will have a lot of material resources. At the end of our lives, we're going to get some form of the following question. If we get to the pearly gates, what we're going to hear is, you know all that money I gave you? What'd you do with it? Did you use it to draw you and your loved ones closer to me? Because otherwise, I'm really disappointed. So the book was written for the average lay person, even those with no faith. But here, I'm going to speak to people that I assume have interest in the faith, if not a devotion to the faith. I'm not going to be shy about the faith as I speak in here. So we're talking about this theology of wealth. Theology being knowledge, truth about God, and what might God say to us and think about wealth. I believe it's incumbent upon people like you to understand the purpose of wealth for the sake of your own souls and also for the sake of the souls of those you love. and for the sake of those who are influenced by your example. Given his last encyclical on the economy, which was Caritas in Veritate, the Pope's encyclical on the economy, given the current financial crisis, given the attention that's been shown to the Vatican Bank even lately, not only should we not be ashamed of talking about money, at a Catholic university, we shouldn't be ashamed of it. I think the Holy Father would be happy to know that we're giving it the attention that we ought to give to it. We need to have a language, an understanding that we can share with others. Now, the title of my talk is, Why Did God Give Us Money? So let's pause and think about the following questions. How many of you out there own slaves? Let me see a show of hands. Good. How many of you think you're going to one day own your children? How many of you think you're going to own your spouse? You know, spouses in some countries are viewed as chattel, property. How many of you think you're going to own your spouse? None of us. We don't think in those terms, that we're going to own those things. But how many of us act as if we own our own lives? As if they're chattel, our own personal property to do with as we please. The world tells us that our lives and our money are ours to do with as we please. And as I accumulated money, I sensed that that worldview might not be correct. So I started studying wealth in its various manifestations. I started collecting data and observations about wealth. And here are a few observations I found. We've all heard there's no such thing as a free lunch. But look around. Look outside today. Look at the earth, the things in it. They're the ultimate free lunch. The first men and women in history found cold streams to drink out of, fish to eat, animals to catch. And they hunted the game and they caught fish, and thousands of generations have enjoyed the earth. The theologian Germain Grisey says nothing in subhuman creation ever comes to be with a label saying this good is meant for this person but not that person, this group but not people of this sort. Instead, both in the beginning of the world and now, God provides all the riches of the material world for all the people to use. In other words, the goods of the earth have a universal destination. They're meant for each and every one of us. When we judge that they're ours alone, whatever happens to be under our control, that it's ours alone to do with as we please, we're like a banker who gets so used to having the money in the vault that he starts thinking that it's his. And when he starts thinking it's his, the depositors of the money, they have a lot of trouble. Okay, we can't have a banker who thinks that the money in the vault belongs to him, because the real owners of the money will have a problem. When you and I start thinking that simply and absolutely we own all the blessings we've been given, then the poor and the needy are going to have problems. Now, if that's true, if God gave the fruits of the earth to all mankind, how then did private ownership of property arise? And how can it be justified? Almost all human societies allow private ownership of at least some amount of property. The best of them promote and protect private ownership, because from time immemorial, experience has shown that private ownership is generally the best way to draw the most good for the maximum number of people. In the 1200s, St. Thomas Aquinas took a look at this. He explained why it works so well. He listed 3 justifications for private property. He said it yields a society that's ultimately wealthier, ordered better, and more harmonious. He said, first, people tend to take better care of property that belongs to them than they did if it belonged to everybody. He said, second, when some of the goods of the earth are clearly designated yours and some are clearly designated mine, we'll have fewer disputes about the property. We'll have a more harmonious society. And finally, if I know that what I own, that the work I put into it, that I get some say-so over it, I'm more likely to work harder for it. And so the prosperity of all society is maximized. And that's why, for those reasons, St. Thomas Aquinas argued smart societies promote and protect the ownership of private property. So although private ownership generally does allow me, if I choose, to keep my goods from you and you to keep your goods from me, selfishness is not the primary justification for it. The strongest justification for that private ownership lies deeper, and it has consequences that are more profound. Private ownership promotes a wealthier and more harmonious society by creating incentives for owners to treat their goods better and to bring forth from them greater wealth than they otherwise would. That's the benefit. And that benefit's really overlooked by people who denounce wealth and money as only things for selfish people. They're in favor of just abolishing private ownership and giving it all away, ignoring the fact that once we disperse with private ownership, we actually get less prosperity and less wealth for everyone. In his last encyclical, the Holy Father noted that the market is, quote, the economic institution that permits encounter between persons. The market is a good thing. It promotes human interaction. It's a beautiful phrase of his. By ensuring that there are more goods all around and that those goods are better taken care of, private ownership promotes the creation of wealth throughout society and on all levels of society, improving the lot of all. However, that doesn't mean that my money is meant merely for me, or that yours is meant merely for you. Arriving at that theoretical, intellectual conclusion is the easy part. Just saying, well, I know it's not only mine and yours is not only yours. That's the easy part. It's much harder to determine what that truth means for us at this point in our lives. And for me, I'm still trying to grow businesses and stuff. So how do I live that out? I found this, though, and this is what I want to encourage upon you, and this is why it's important for you to go ahead and start thinking about money intently now. Money can wreak havoc if you're not careful with it. This is not new information. People see rich folks who go off the deep end and have problems. But I decided I wanted to dig a little more deeper. Why is that the case? Why does money seem to create problems at times? And I found several reasons. First, money can threaten those we love. Benjamin Franklin said, "He does not possess wealth that allows it to possess him." Handled properly, money can improve so many things. It provides the fundamentals to those in need. It brings transportation and health and music and beauty to a world that without money would have great difficulty gathering the sufficient resources to undertake such grand projects. Misused, however, money seriously damages those who receive it, particularly when they're young and they come into wealth before their character is formed. Secondly, money can stifle initiative. Helen Keller once said, "Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved." Third, money can work against our humility and our gratitude. We start to expect the things that money can purchase as our God-given rights. Fourth, money can threaten our identities. There's an old Yiddish proverb that says, "With money in your pocket, you are wise and you are handsome and you sing well too." When you have money, people treat you differently. And the fact that others may treat us differently, it can lead to an initial period of feeling really great. There's elation that wow, everyone's friendly to me. And then it fades, and all of a sudden it can turn into fear and a sense of isolation. And finally, cynicism. Well, I guess the only reason they're interested in me is because I have money. Fifth, money can lead to quick fixes, or at least the thought that quick fixes work. To those who suddenly acquire non-essential wealth, it can seem that money can solve almost any problem without having to exercise patience, humility, or perform the difficult acts of sacrificial love that actually mend the rifts between souls and communities. We see this with rich parents who try to fix everything for their kids. They don't have time for their kids, so they figure the money can fix it. Money will buy you a pretty good dog, but it won't buy the wag of his tail. There's some things that money won't buy. Sixth, money can bring with it irrational guilt. Why me? And then that leads to all kind of guilt. Guilt is good when it's attached to sin. But when it's irrational, it leads to a dysfunctional psychology. Seventh, money can distract us. Having more than one choice, usually that improves your life. But when you get just a plethora of choices, Let's see, I could buy anything. Well, you see people spend hours and hours on deciding exactly the kind of wood to put in the wine cellar that will buy the wines that they spend hours and hours and hours. And at some point you say, to what end? I know that's not a struggle you're dealing with right now. But here's what's crazy. It can affect people at every level. The more choices, at first it sounds good, and then it starts to distract you from the basic process of living life. 8th, money can increase our frustration. That may sound odd. You would think money would make things better. But I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. When I go, I can't remember whether they have Waffle Houses in Washington, D.C. or not, but we got a lot of Waffle Houses in Georgia. So when I go to Waffle House, we go to Waffle House a lot, and I like to go to Waffle House to get my eggs and bacon and my toast and my coffee. And things are good. And every now and then, she'll forget something, right? She brings it, and she forgot the grits, or she forgot the coffee, or she forgot the bacon. Well, she forgot it, whatever. She said, do you want me to get it for you? No, it's going to take too long because I'm in a hurry. So fine. And I'm good. Now, if instead I'm staying at a nice hotel, okay, where when you order room service, you order scrambled eggs and grits, or they don't have grits up here, but you order scrambled eggs and toast and bacon and orange juice and coffee, okay, it costs $50. I mean, it's ridiculous. It costs $50. But actually, it's usually pretty good. It's a little bit better than Waffle House. But you get there, and they bring it up, and they haven't brought the bacon. Okay? Now, when I open that, and I'm paying $50 for breakfast, and they don't have my bacon, I'm miserable. I am really miserable. I'm livid. I cannot believe I'm paying $50 for breakfast, and they forgot the bacon? You know? And so I got all this money, and what's it doing to me? And I just use that as an example because we can all, I mean, you may not buy many $50 breakfasts, but you can see where I'm coming from here. At the Waffle House, it was fine that they missed the bacon. Why is it bothering me now? Okay, something about that ability with money that can really distort us. And finally, we have this law of diminishing returns that guarantees that as we pay ever more for something, we always reach a point where our increased expenditures merely increase the disproportion between how much money we pay and what we get. And that in turn increases the odds we'll be disappointed and the likelihood we'll lose our patience or our temper or castigate someone more heavily than we would otherwise. I know because I've done it. I've been less gracious with workers in fine hotels than with less competent workers at roadside motels. I'm not proud of that behavior. I'm just telling you what the money can do, what can happen to any of us. So those are the negative things, but let me be very clear. Money is good. It facilitates the transfer of goods and services. Money increases the interdependence that we have with one another. And money can be used wonderfully effective, as a wonderfully effective tool in God's service. So now we get to the crucial point. What would God have us do with it? I think God wants us to use our wealth to grow closer to Him and to help those we love grow closer to Him and help others in their spiritual and corporal needs. I think that's why we have money. Now, on the one hand, given what I've said so far and the general sentiments of most people, this may sound a little obvious, but do we really act in that manner? Do we act as if that's what we want money for? I think there's some specific vocations that we can have as we're acquiring money. The first thing, as we're acquiring money, as we're spending it, as we're using it, the first thing to ask ourselves is, am I growing in virtue as I do this? As I build a business or as I spend the proceeds of that business, am I growing in virtue? I speak about this in my book, and I was so happy to see that in this last encyclical on the economy, when Pope Benedict spoke about money, he specifically used the language of vocation in speaking of economic matters. See, so many people say, oh, vocation, that's the holy thing, and then the money-making, that's the ugly stuff. No, no, no. A vocation is what you ought to be following as you both seek to create wealth and spend it and use it. That's the first vocation, being virtuous. And we got to use our wealth to grow in virtue. The second vocation of those with wealth is to create more of it. And that includes everyone in this room, not just people on Wall Street. All of us should create wealth, which means creating something of value. Anytime you create something of value, you create something that increases somebody else's well-being. And think about the word wealth. What's the root of it? Weal. It's an old English word meaning well-being. Anytime you increase the well-being of someone else, you've created wealth. Some wealth is compensated different than others in monetary terms, but anytime you do that, you've created wealth. And that's an obligation on all of us. You know what Pope Benedict said in his World Message for Peace, January 1, 2009? FYI, the New York Times did not report on this. He said, wealth creation, this is the Holy Father, wealth creation therefore becomes an inescapable duty which must be kept in mind if the fight against material poverty is to be effective in the long term. Think about it. The Holy Father is telling us wealth creation is an inescapable duty. Specifically, the creation of wealth can in fact be a vocation. So long as we can continue to create wealth efficiently, we have a general obligation to do so. Not just so that our own assets can increase, but so that through our efforts, others may obtain the fundamentals that they need, and that we can help serve that universal destination of goods that I spoke about earlier. And then there's a third vocation for those with wealth, giving. Giving and giving some now. And let me tell you why. Giving now saves those who need it right now. Giving now keeps money from being misused in the ways that I cataloged earlier. And giving now forms us in virtue. And by the way, I'm speaking to every one of you. I know most of you students may be saying, I really don't have any money right now. But you do have some money. And you could sacrifice something. And that sacrifice will build you in virtue. And so, y'all may have seen there's sociological data that has surveyed people about their amount of wealth. And they've said, how much money would you consider you would need to have in order to be well off? And everybody picks a number that's about 50% more than what they have now. Even the billionaires, okay? A guy with $2 billion says, well, yeah, but given all the obligations I've got, da-da-da-da-da, but I think if I had $3 billion, I'd probably, at that point, I would be pretty secure, okay? Everybody figures, just get me over that next hump, and then I'll be good, okay? I do it, and all of you do it. And the point is, we have to give now because that's what gets us detached. That's what helps us grow in virtue. Giving now helps us to be happy. Now, why do I make this last claim? I'll tell you why. I want to make a few observations, and then I'll close and open it for questions. One of my heroes, John Paul II, wrote a wonderful essay, encyclical, called Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth. What a wonderful phrase. Truth does have splendor. Truth is the bottom line of philosophy, and truth can't be negated. It's there whether you acknowledge it or not. And if we continue, truth and all the good things of this earth, they're gifts. None of us earns the truth. When we figure out how an engine works, or we discover a new cancer drug, or a way to teach children more effectively, we may have worked hard to find the truth, but the truth is a gift. In fact, I think the entire economy of this world is an economy of the gift. None of us earned our birth, or our parents, or our intellect, or our sensitivities, or our talents, or our spouses, not many of you have spouses, but some of you do, or our children, or the air we breathe, or the harmony we hear with our ears, or the sunsets we see with our eyes. They're all gifts. I'll tell you, I've worked really hard all my life, but the best things in my life are gifts. And so if this economy of the world is actually one of the gift, then the only method we can be the only way we can be fully human, fully what we're intended to be, is being consistent with this order within the universe. In other words, giving of a gift, philanthropy, the love of other men, anthropos, anthropy, philos, love of, philanthropy, the love of others, the giving of ourselves, allows us to become what we were designed and supposed to be. Fully human. And that's the only way we can be truly happy. The happiest people I know, and I know a lot of rich people, but I will tell you, the happiest people I know are the ones that understand this economy of the gift and this notion of being fully human. Whether consciously or subconsciously, they know it and they understand it and they practice it. That's the economy of the gift which governs this universe. The problem is, it's hard for us to accept because, like it or not, in our culture today, we're like fish swimming in our culture. We don't know that we're actually in water, but we're swimming in our culture. We've all become materialist. I think the world is a constant battle between a materialist view and a transcendent view. And the materialist view, because of our culture, it's the easier one to have as a default position. And so whether we like it or not, we live in this illusory world that denies the transcendent rather than make sacrifices to understand the reality of that which is transcendent. And I think the truth, reality, is in the economy of the gift. Materialism says all that matters is matter. Okay? The Enlightenment came along and said, if we can't sense it and measure it and touch it, feel it, taste it, see it, hear it, it doesn't exist. But you know what's interesting in today's business world? Matter matters less and less. Intangibles matter more and more. Many of you have taken accounting. Okay? What's an intangible asset? It's not something you can taste and touch and feel and see and hear. I mean, look at the balance sheet of Google. All right? And the balance sheet of Google, I haven't looked lately, but the balance sheet of Google probably has, assets minus liability. It's probably like $20 billion. The market cap for Google, what Google's deemed to be worth, is probably about $200 billion. So the other $180 billion of what? I mean, here's what the company owns. Here's what they owe. The difference is what it's, quote, worth, because we created balance sheets back in a time when a company was worth what it owned minus what it owed. That was the net worth. So now we say Google's net worth is $20 billion, and yet the market values Google at $200 billion because they're valuing that which is immaterial. These intangibles matter more and more, and I think this understanding of it within business can help transform our society to say it's not just the material that matters. Our current market crisis has a number of contributing factors, this global financial crisis. But one of the critical factors is that intangibles on balance sheets have come to represent an increasing portion of the net worth of businesses, and intangibles are a lot harder to understand than tangible things. We can't be silly and just say they're worthless. We know that a loan on a bank's balance sheet, that's an asset. We know that a loan is worth something, even if it's worth less than what the bank is saying. Maybe it's a loan that's in default or what, but it's worth something, that loan. The problem is the asset's intangible, and it's hard to value intangible things. You know, that loan on a bank's balance sheet, you know what that asset really is? That loan, you know what a loan is? And a loan, that asset, is a representation of a relationship between human beings. I want you to understand, the biggest entities in the world, these big banks, they're listing as assets things that are nothing but relationships between human beings. That's what a loan is. You know, we talk about a global financial credit crisis. You know what the root of the word credit is? Credo, to believe. A loan is only an asset if there's a belief by both parties that the person who borrowed the money will pay it back. The loan is an expression of order of human relations. And when that order between human relations becomes disordered, the value of the asset plummets. And that's what we've seen in the last 4 years. Human relations have become disordered, and we're not valuing things as we ought to, and the value of the assets are plummeting. Physicists started figuring out this immateriality of the world, at the beginning of the 20th century. What are we mostly made up of, matter or energy? You know the model of the atom? The little particles, it's mostly air and energy. We're mostly not matter. Now, why am I harping on this? Well, I'm an investor. I want to make money. And particularly in these times, I want to make sure I'm investing wisely. If this non-materiality is indeed an increasingly important part of our reality, and I want to invest in this modern world and participate in the economy of the gift, what ought I to invest in? This is, by the way, a recommendation that I guarantee you will make you rich. I'm going to quote you someone who gave this investment hint a few years ago, right before he became the Pope. Cardinal Ratzinger was saying his last homily before he went into the College of Cardinals, the conclave that elected him as Pope. In his last homily before he was Pope, he said, of all the things on this earth, buildings, mountains, rivers, art, of all the things on this earth, the only one that is eternal is the human soul. Now think about that. If eternity exists, and that's a big if, we can't prove eternity exists, but if eternity exists, then by far the greatest investment that can be made in reality is an investment in the human soul, either our own souls or the souls of others. That's how we do well by doing good. I'm going to mention a business concept here that many of you be familiar with, because when we think about the time value of money and what assets are worth and discounted cash flow, some of you may have already had that, some of you may not have. But we know this: if you can extend the time frame over which you get good returns from an investment, then the value of the investment goes through the roof. In other words, if one investment yields you a return of 15% a year for 5 years, but the other yields you 15% for 100 years, the value of the one that yields you 15% for 100 years is much superior. So imagine if you're getting a return on your investment, and the return pays dividends into eternity. That's what happens to an investment into a soul. And if I know this, though, why do I hold back? Because I do hold back. In business, and this gets to another business concept, and this is something that we in business have to navigate, because we want to invest for that which gives us the greatest wealth and the greatest well-being, but we have a tendency to hedge our risk. We take precautions against risk. That's why we buy insurance. We want to avoid catastrophic loss. That's why we sign a contract. We want to provide for a contingency in case it arises, so the parties know what they're going to do. We hedge. And that's a sensible thing to do oftentimes in the business world. The problem, however, is that most of us also try to hedge our risk with God and with our own souls. In Atlanta, the pastor that my wife and I had when we were first married, he was a great guy named Father Joe Peacock. He had a great sense of humor. And he was talking one day about the folks who always got to Mass late and left early. And he said, you know, I was trying to figure out what's going on. What's their gig? And why is it the same people, always late, always out of here early? And he says, I finally figured it out. He said, they're coming and sort of thinking, I'm not sure I buy into all of this, but just in case, count me in. And I thought, you know, that's what we all do a little bit. Don't we all do that to some degree? We all hedge just a little bit. The problem is the one thing in life we can't hedge with is the fate of our souls. It's an all or nothing proposition. Do you know what God said about hedging? There's actually a commentary on hedging in the Bible, the book of Revelation. And he says, you were neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm, so I vomited you out of my mouth. Now, I know that sounds harsh, being vomited out of God's mouth. But then again, do any of us want to be working with someone who's lukewarm about what they're doing? No. So if we decide we really want to buy in and make this investment, the investment of greatest return in the human soul, to what should we turn? We all want our bellies filled, but beyond that, what we really crave is something more fundamental. What we really crave is communion. We want communion with God and with each other. That's what children also want. We want common union with each other. That's what communion is, common union with one another. We crave communion. We can't live without it. What we're all sharing in this place right now is a communion. We're gathered for a common purpose, a common union. And since it's a good purpose, and it's a good communion. It's a communion that can make us happy. You know one reason it's so much more fun to go to a football game and watch it with 90,000 people? Or why do 1 million people crowd into Times Square to watch the ball drop? I mean, honestly, you know, in the rain and the cold, why? The communion of it all. Now, the reason I'm going on about this is I think we need communion so badly, we crave it. It's such a fundamental need that we're going to get communion. We're social animals. We need it to survive, and we'll do anything to get it. And every human being is going to obtain communion. It'll be either a good communion or a bad one. We can't avoid it. It's like avoiding breathing. We form attachments because nature abhors a vacuum, and we need it to survive. I think we can get rich by forming good and holy communions. I'm not trying to sound pious. I am dead serious. As much money as I've made, the most happiness I have is from the communions that I've at times used my money to help create. If man does not have good communion with that which is holy and true, he'll have communion with that which is not holy and true. And that will rob him of his full humanity. So as we come together and we talk about wealth, let's think about how we form full and true communions with God and how we might cultivate those things for our family members and those we love. That's what we're supposed to do with our money. I mentioned we got to cultivate our virtue, we got to create wealth, we got to give it away. But at the end of the day, what we're really supposed to do is create these communions. That's why God gave us money. That's why he gives us stewardship over whatever gifts we have. To first be in communion with him and then others through him. And we ought to use our money to do it. Oddly enough, we have money in order to grow closer to God. Earlier this year in an audience with civic authorities in Rome, the Holy Father once again addressed the economic crisis. It's been really interesting. He's been on top of this economic crisis, commenting on it for the last 4 years. He said the first step toward creating a wealthier society is to, quote, rediscover relationships as the constituent element of our lives, as that thing that constitutes the essence of our lives are our relationships. He knows that our relationships with God and one another are the essence of our wealth. A few years ago, one morning, I was reading a French priest. He was writing about the silkworm. If you think about what a silkworm does, it's grounded in reality, and yet within that reality, it eats leaves and it creates silk. One of the wonders of the world, a luxury. We have a chance to do that. If you look at what they're doing out in Silicon Valley creating wealth, I mean, Silicon Valley, right? You take sand and you create wealth out of it. You enhance others' well-being. But the greatest investment we can make, and what I want to urge on you, as we seek to create this material wealth, what I want to urge on you is think of wealth in a broader sense. Think of the greatest wealth you can create as an investment in your own soul and the soul of those around you. That's the return on investment that lasts forever. That's what gives us happiness that's not just transitory, but transcendent. From time immemorial, since Adam and Eve, okay? Since Adam and Eve, men have been trying to figure out how to be like gods. Well, we can't be gods, but we can be like God. We can be like God. We can give like God. We can give everything we have of our treasure and of our hearts and of our talents and of our lives. Being generous is how we can be like God and be happy. I will tell you as I close, the purpose of money, the meaning of money, is to help us be like God. That's why God gave us money. Now, I want to take questions from y'all, but thank you very much for your attention today. And don't hold back. I don't view any question as beyond the unless you just deliberately insult me, is beyond the scope of courtesy. So whatever questions you may want to ask. Yes, sir, right here.
I had a question concerning the changing nature of money. You mentioned, going back to the 1200s, then we had a barter system, and then it went to coins, and now it's something quite different. I was wondering what you thought of how man changes how they use money or how they understand money. Like now, it's not even, if I'm correct, it's not even based off a gold standard anymore. It's a
fiat money.
Yeah, it's fiat. Yes.
So
does that hinder or help, or does it do really nothing to what this purpose of wealth is?
Right. That's an interesting question. It actually has some philosophical ramifications. Money itself is a language by which we communicate things to one another. So if you want to buy this podium, okay, I tell you this, it costs this much, and it's sort of a language. And so like any language, if the language gets corrupted, the communication will not be as effective. So the hazard with fiat money is the language of the money gets corrupted because we don't know what a dollar is going to be worth 10 years from now. okay? Because the government, or any currency, it's not just the dollar, okay? Most currencies around the world today are fiat currencies. For those of you who don't know, that means fiat means they exist at the will of the government, and there's not gold that stands behind them. You can't. You used to take a dollar bill to the government and get an ounce of gold for it. You can't do that anymore, and very few first world countries have. I don't know if any have a gold standard, so they're fiat money, and if you've got a country like Switzerland that is really disciplined about their currency, what they're really doing is being disciplined about their language that people communicate within the market. The hazard, and we're watching it right now with our economy because we're printing tons of money. And there are various justifications that are given for that and different opinions about it. But what it does is it increases the uncertainty about what that dollar will mean in the future. So just imagine if all of a sudden you're wondering, you're going to go into a society where people only understand half of the words you're using, right? Well, if the meaning of a dollar starts altering because of inflation, or the meaning of a yen, or the meaning of the euro, okay, it does affect how people act, and I personally think we're at great risk. It is a corrupting thing that happens when a currency gets inflated like that, and we're doing that now. Yes, sir.
As far as I know, you're not the first businessman who's interested in knowing, what should I do with all this money and so on. But you seem to be saying that looking at the past, you didn't find any answers. I was wondering, to what extent did you look at people like Andrew Carnegie, for instance, who wrote The Gospel of Wealth, which seems to resonate with your theology of wealth, I guess. And he eventually believed that there is a man who dies rich is not a man, and things like this. So right. It seems to me there's a long line of people who have been in your situation and have reacted. Maybe you have your take, being a Catholic, is different, I suppose. But did you get inspired by those people, or? Definitely
with Carnegie. There were. Here's what's interesting. The problem is, and the reason. Here's why there's a bit of a vacuum. So first of all, he's referencing Andrew Carnegie, who was in the steel business back around the 1900s, and he wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, and he addressed some of these questions. And there's a medieval Jewish philosopher, Maimonides, and he wrote about this. Okay, Augustine wrote a little bit. Thomas Aquinas wrote a little bit about it. The problem is Aristotle did. So people have thought about this issue. It tends to be that philosophers are usually in academia and don't have firsthand experience with money, and so it's more theoretical. And so it's sort of like if you're a biologist, at some point you want to go into the lab and actually dissect something to kind of understand it, but the philosopher doesn't have that chance with money because they have to imagine what it's like to have X million dollars, right? So the philosophers don't end up being as on target with that. The business guys, first of all, haven't learned the language of philosophy, and they don't have the time and energy to go about it. I mean, Forbes does every year their Forbes 400. They print the 400 richest people in the country. This last issue was on philanthropy, and there were some decent things said, and they convened panels, and Bill Gates and his wife were on it, and different people. But it takes a lot of disciplined thinking. So I hope I was not suggesting that I'm sort of the first person that's ever thought of it. There have been a lot of people to think about these issues. The problem is to put them together systematically, to then be a guide, not for philosophers, but for people in business. That's what is missing. And there are not a lot of people taking much of a shot at that. Even, like I said, Bill Gates, he's a really smart guy, and he's got a lot of experience. And if they'll have him on a forum and they'll talk, but at the end of the day, he's just sitting there saying, somebody else can write a book. He's not doing it. Or if he does it, he hires somebody to ghostwrite it, and it's not really his thoughts. So many of the people I see with business, and they've appreciated the book I wrote because they say, well, wow, I mean, the reason I wrote it for myself, and then I was going to give it to my brother also because we're in business together. And then I was talking to friends about it, and they'd say, oh, these are people in business who made a lot of money. Would you send me your notes? Because they knew they wanted to think systematically about it, but it was going to take a lot of time that might take them away from their business or their golf, and they didn't want to do it. It's sort of like, I worked so hard to get the money. You mean I got to work that hard to understand now how to spend it well? I don't know if I want to do that. And so just very few. Carnegie did, because I think he was just that, he had that philosophical bent. So yeah, there are a line of people, and there will continue to be people who are very thoughtful about it. But what happens, and I'll tell you what happens with a lot of people, and you all ought to be aware of this, with any gift you give to anybody of whatever level, there's this notion that the good intention alone is sufficient. And we know good intentions aren't enough in your class. I mean, so what if you want to get an A, you got to earn it. And in almost everything in life, good intention, they're a good starting point, but good intentions aren't enough. And yet we think when it comes to giving, well, the thought was there. What do you mean? Was there really thought there? Was there enough thought there? Or did you just say, well, it's a gift, they ought to appreciate it? And I think with anything, so many times we give money to people and we actually set them back. You create dependence, right? People do this with their children all the time. They give them stuff saying, well, I mean well, and I love my kids, so here, I'm giving them this. That's not good. I mean, it can be. It's good to feed them, right? But not to give them a new Mercedes when they turn 16. Is that good? Well, I love them. Okay, fine, you love them. Well, I mean well. Okay, fine, you mean. We're not there yet. Let's be more thoughtful about this, more deliberate about it. And that's what, when I say a theology of it, I'm using that term a little loose, although I do think we ought to seek wisdom that God speaks about this, because money is such an integral part of our lives. But I think there needs to be systematic thought, like a field of study, about how we treat these things. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I haven't really formulated this question. I'm doing it on the fly, but in the recent years, philanthropy has obviously become a big deal in our society, and especially amongst seculars, if you will. So kind of following on this last question, a Warren Buffett type, the extraordinarily secular kind of probably intent, and I don't want to ascribe intent to someone else, but one sees the secular philanthropy having more and more of a power in terms of the political realm, and just in terms of how, the power they're wielding, because it seems more and more wealth is going into this area. And I guess my question to you is, if you don't have a transcendent kind of eternal goalpost,
right?
I see a lot of danger in that. To your point about there can be dangerous philanthropy out there, and I think we're seeing the effects of it. Yeah,
because you're not anchored correctly. And so now I will give credit to, say, the Gates Foundation. They're working on eradicating malaria in Africa, but it started with birth control. Right, but they were even heavier, right? And then I have my own theories about why they altered it a little bit. But anyway, so if it's not rooted correctly, it can do all sorts of damage. With regard to the Buffett, I tell you what, let's, because I don't want to sit in judgment on, and I know you're not asking me to, on Warren Buffett per se, but I will say this: within the corporate world, within society, we misuse the word philanthropy. Okay, philanthropy is not the giving of money to something, or the donation of money. Philanthropy is the love of other men and women. And in my opinion, if love is not the source of why you're giving, it's not philanthropy. We may call it philanthropy, but you're violating what the word itself means. And let's face it, a lot of corporate giving is for public relations. A lot of private giving is for public relations. People want others to think well of them. That's not actually, you can get into vanity and the sin of vanity, but public relations for a corporation is not a bad thing, but it's not charity, it's not philanthropy. It's not born out of love. And I can make an argument that for a public company, if I'm a shareholder, I don't want them giving. I mean, I didn't hire them to give my money away to charities that I may or may not believe in. So with our public company, we had a program for a while where we, while we were making money, I hadn't made money in the last couple of years, but while we were making money, and we basically allowed the shareholders, we did make charitable contributions, but we allowed the shareholders to pick, based on their percentage of ownership, where they wanted their charity going. because, I mean, it's their money, right? And what a lot of corporations do is they give it, the CEO gives a big donation, he gets a lot of attention for himself, and he did this donation with the money of other people. So there's all kind of distortion, I think, in our society about what philanthropy truly is. If someone, there are good instincts in a lot of secularists for what we think of within the Catholic Church as corporal works of mercy. You know, feeding the poor and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and healing those who are sick. And I think that's a good thing, but even then, when it's the most ordered form of charity is the charity which understands the eternal truths. And the further away you get away from the eternal truths, the more chance you have of, I think, doing harm when you throw money at something. I mean, I listed all those ways that money can harm people. It can harm the recipients of charity if it's done the wrong way, because it can, a lot of the aid that's gone to Africa over the years has been misused by third world dictators and discouraged the incentives of the local societies to form their own communities. But you know what? Doing the kind of philanthropy that really works is a lot harder. It's just with almost anything, it's a lot easier to throw money at something, including your children. They're whining. Finally, fine. Here's $10. Problem goes away. I feel good. They feel good for now. So I think a lot of philanthropy ends up like that, and a whole lot of it. It's become popular now, and some people jump on listen. There could be worse things to be popular than giving money away. So I don't want to sound like, I'm actually glad that there is a sense, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to run on with this. Y'all may have heard there's this giving pledge that a lot of billionaires have said, I'll give away. That's not a bad thing. I mean, it's somebody sort of saying to them, I mean, like $10 billion, honestly, if you've been born in Bangladesh, you probably wouldn't have amassed a fortune of $10 billion. So you might consider that others might have access to some of those, and people are stepping up and saying yes. So I think that's whether it's secular or not, just like the secular myths of old might have had within them a kernel of divinity, some of these secular trends can have within them some truth, and then it's our job as believers to help sort of help give that structure and form, and I think we can do that. We done? Yeah. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.